we tell them there's this mechanism for being right with God, that can get turned into a kind of equation that if I just believe this thing, if I just tick a box, that's what God is looking for in order for me to make it to heaven after I die. And the reality of the story is we're being invited into a life that begins at salvation that extends into eternity.
The book is entitled The God of Story. It is written by Dr. Daniel Schwabauer, an individual who is a teacher of English at Mid-American Nazarene University. He is an individual that has written quite a bit in the area of science fiction and fantasy and the rest. The book is published by Baker Books, and he is an individual that actually did some of his earlier work in creative writing with James Gunn, who is probably best known as a science fiction writer, and also did his doctoral work with Leonard Sweet. And I was just thinking, gosh, we haven't said that name in a long time, going all the way back. I was looking up, Soul Tsunami was one of the many interviews we did with him. That was a quarter of a century ago. But nevertheless, we bring Daniel Schwabauer to the microphone. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Let's, if I can, get into this idea of story. And part of early on, you say that the evangelical church has oftentimes not had a place or maybe even has abandoned the arts. We talk about that quite a bit. As a matter of fact, my producer has produced one of our booklets on imagination, which I think you'd appreciate, and he just finished doing another science fiction film as an actor. But that is something that we need. And it's been your experience that sometimes we can learn from some of the techniques that you teach in an English class to begin to discover, if you will, the narrative of Scripture. Can you explain?
Well, it's my conviction that we're deficient in the arts in part because we've seen the Bible as a list of propositional truths. We've broken it into verses, and we tend to look at those verses as individual truth statements. And we've flattened it, and we've removed the narrative patterns. We've, in a way, blinded ourselves to see what the various stories and the overarching story of Scripture is actually telling us through what I like to call the language of story. There's something that's going on in the Bible that is not just Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It's also this way of communicating deep truths from generation to generation using storytelling patterns. And it's ironic because we live in a time when I would say that we're more inundated with stories. We're more immersed in stories than we've ever been. I mean, everybody carries around a portable cinema in their pockets.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, though we're really fluent in the language of story, we're not, in the church, we're not literate. We don't understand those patterns. And my wife likes to say that our Bible cups are already full, and we bring a full cup to the Bible and we end up seeing in it what we've always seen in it. And that tends to be things that are broken into little pieces that make good sermons, or, very, not that they aren't true patterns that you might hear in a church every Sunday, but we don't necessarily see other things that are going on through the metaphors of Scripture and through the story patterns that are happening all the way throughout, from Genesis to Revelation.
I do see some changes in that, and that is, for example, just a few miles from where I'm broadcasting is Dallas Theological Seminary. Now, if you want to get a seminary that's going to give you systematic theology and Bible exposition and on and on and on, they can break it down into the very small minutia, even down to the Greek and Hebrew words. But the president of Dallas Theological Seminary has been for some time talking about the story of Scripture and helping people put all of it together and understanding story. So that's one thing. But also, I was just thinking, Daniel, for just a few minutes before we get back into your book, it does seem to me that people that are trying to reach the next generation, and that's certainly something we've been talking about here at Point of View. How do we reach Generation Y? Earlier this week, we had a millennial roundtable. How do we reach Generation Z? It seems reaching them through story and maybe even the meta-narrative of Scripture is going to be even more successful and important in the 21st century. What are your thoughts?
Well, I completely agree. As a professor at a university where I deal with students on a daily basis, I do see a deep hunger in that generation. I think what they're looking for is is meaning, but it's the sort of meaning that you really get from a story. And one of the mistakes we've made, I think, is we've tried to bring people propositional truth, and I don't think they're hungry for that. I think what they want is a story worth living. And I would say Jesus has the only story worth living. It's the only one that will not only give you those propositional truths, but will actually make something worthwhile and purposeful of your life. And that's what I try to invite my students to. But it's what I think the Bible is really showing us God's unfolding story, which includes humanity to this amazing degree where he just has invited every human being, every image bearer, into joining his story and becoming part of the narrative of not just of Scripture, but the narrative of reality.
Well, again, one of the best storytellers is Jesus himself. And you tell a story that made me smile when you talked about being in this class, and your class was looking at Mark chapter 4. And interestingly enough, it's labeled as a lamp on a stand, although I really think it has more to do with sowers and seeds and things of that nature. But if you tell that story, because I maybe didn't laugh out loud, but I've had a big smile on my face when you go all the way around the room and individuals that you would think would be pretty good at picking out the significance of a story were, I guess, to use the word, clueless. Can you explain?
Yeah. Well, it was a class in Old English, medieval English, and many of the manuscripts we have in that language they come from monks that were translating parts of the New Testament. So as part of the homework, we had to regularly translate some of these, old scrolls, and we were working on Mark 4, the parable of the sower, and we translated it. We brought in our handwritten notes, and then we were sitting in a circle, and the professor had us read from our translations. And then after we did that, one of the students said, "Professor, what does this mean?" Mm-hmm. And that shocked me because, in Mark chapter 4, he doesn't just tell the story of the parable. The disciples come to him and they say, the same thing. What are you talking about? And Jesus explains it to them. And so we had translated the explanation as well. And so when the student asked that, I thought, well, he's just going to say, well, look in front of you. It's right there in your own handwriting. And instead, he pointed to the person next to me. I was sitting to his right. He pointed to the person to my right. So he just went past me and he said, "What do you think it means?" And that student said, "I don't know." And he went around the room, and one by one, every single student in the class said, "I have no idea what it means."
Wow.
And then so this was probably 18 to 25 students. It's been a while. Then the student said, "Well, what does it mean, Professor?" And the professor said, "Oh, I don't know."
And we had kind of an unintended cliffhanger there, but I think you got most of it in. You go around the room and you ask everyone, what does Mark chapter 4, the parable, actually mean? Nobody has a clue, including the professor. And you use that to then go on and explain that not only did the disciples ask Jesus what the parable meant, later they ask why he speaks in parables. And for people that want everything in terms of propositional truth, that kind of causes a problem. But Jesus told story after story, parable after parable, so that he could explain what the kingdom of heaven was like, what salvation is like, in this case, what evangelism would be like. And that, I think, illustrates why this issue of story is so important, isn't it?
It is a great illustration of that. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in answering the question of the disciples, what do you mean by this parable? He sometimes used parables to explain his parables. And that kind of, as Enlightenment rationalists, it makes us kind of shake our heads and go, get to the point, which, it may have had the same effect on the disciples. If you go to the Last Supper, they say, "Now at last you're speaking plainly," which to me implies that they'd had a lot of befuddlement along the way, wondering what he was doing.
Yes.
And, probably later in their life, they put things together and started to recognize what was going on. But that, to me, is the point. A great story forces us to either lean in and process it or kind of fold our arms and say, "I don't care." And that's why I think in the parable of the sower example specifically, when they ask him why he speaks in parables, part of his answer is this idea of putting a lamp on a stand.
Yes.
And we miss it because it doesn't fit our grid, because we think it would be the opposite. What Jesus is saying there is that the parable is the stand that makes the light go farther.
Right.
And we think, no, the parable makes things muddy. To make the light go farther, we need to be clear. But that's not that wasn't his method. His method wasn't clarity. His method was something like provocation and depth, and the offer to allow people to be ever seeing but never perceiving, or to kind of accept. One of the metaphors I use is he's got this field full of Easter eggs, and he has a big sign up, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. That's saying there's Easter eggs hidden here. Come and look with me, and it's up to you whether you go look or not. But those who seek will actually find. And he kind of summarizes that by saying whatever is hidden was meant to be found, right? It was meant to be disclosed by him. Whatever was concealed was meant to be brought out in the open. So, consider carefully what you're hearing. Listen, pay attention, have ears to hear. And we tend to just want the point. And this is, I'm not picking on the education system, but our education system is kind of geared to impart knowledge,
right,
not necessarily truth.
Just give the answer.
So kids learn, just give me the answer. What's the thing? I mean, that's what we do with our phones now. I see it a lot with students. What's the answer? I'll just go to AI. That will give me the answer. And no, actually, the question is probably more important. You need to sit with it and ponder it.
Well said.
And that's what the parables do.
Yeah. And again, it gets to one of the topics we've addressed here, Daniel, at a point of view, because obviously when we do apologetics, talking about defending the Christian faith, a lot of that is logical, linear, kind of left hemisphere.
Sure.
But we've also had people like Paul Gold on the program talking about cultural apologetics, which gets into art and literature and culture, which I think appeals to people that maybe are right hemisphere thinkers. And it seems to me that we have maybe focused too much on one side rather than the other, which I think is a good lead-in for maybe having you convene a class for just a few minutes and talking about the idea of the pyramid and the deductive and inductive structure, which I'm sure you use to teach in your class. But help us out, because that's going to be helpful in terms of understanding Scripture as well as understanding other stories, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So journalists like to talk about the upside down pyramid of journalism, which is hard. Not all journalism, but hard news is structured to give you in like a newspaper. The first paragraph will have the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so it gives you the general overview of the story. And if you read the first paragraph, you know basically what happened. If you keep reading, you're going to get more details. And so that's conceived of as a kind of deductive upside down pyramid that starts at the top with the general stuff and then ends with the specific stuff. And that's not the way feature stories are structured. They're structured the other way around, which means they begin with details or specifics and they move towards general statements. And that's actually very useful when trying to build a case and drawing people through a more story format rather than the deductive is more suited for lectures and sermons and hard news stories. Both of those are valid ways of telling stories. The problem is that we tend to not remember very much from deductive storytelling.
Right.
And when we go through an inductive feature story, we will remember some of the specifics, and we will even, possibly be talked into the general conclusion that the author has. But that's not what Jesus didn't use either one of those quite when he did his long form parables. And it's not what most novels and films use either. They use an abductive structure, which is like an upside down pyramid with the base missing. So it's like a right side up pyramid with the base missing. So it begins with these specifics and it moves through details and it kind of leads you up towards something, and then it doesn't actually state it. It presents you with the evidence in it, and then it invites you to draw a conclusion.
Right.
And the reason I say that is the most effective way of storytelling is because that's how we process life. Life does not come with things labeled good and bad. It does not come, with someone standing there with a microphone telling us, the events of our life and which of the Socratic virtues we should attach to it. Instead, it is open to interpretation. And because of that, when you tell a story that sort of guides people towards the truth, it gives them the autonomy and the dignity of deciding for themselves whether they're going to learn or not. And that's really, it's really a powerful technique of storytelling that I think a lot of artists know intuitively. And they understand, I think, that if you don't let the audience, if you don't risk the audience misunderstanding you, you're not doing art at all. It's okay to not do art, but when you're doing art, you should be doing art, right? So the abductive process of starting with specifics and leading people through a kind of, not exactly like life, but it mirrors life more closely than does something like deductive storytelling.
And again, one of the quotes you have in there comes from Leonard Sweet, who I just mentioned before. A deductive sermon appeals to the mind, but not the heart. And there are times when obviously we need to have put together those propositional statements, especially as you're going through the epistles and maybe Apostle Paul is giving you a long list. Of course, you're going to want to deal with that. But as you say a little bit later, you can say, never steal, or I'll use my example, as this one's not in your book. You could start by talking about what happened when someone broke into your car and took all of the change that you had there and left a big fat mess, or somebody broke into your house and stole your television set and your cell phone and all of that. You have the, if you will, the emotional grip. And then at the end, when you're making the case about do not steal, you have used a more inductive approach and have reached, I would have to say, the heart, not just the head. Is that fair?
That's very fair. It's very, very well put. And I agree with that completely. We don't just need, propositional truths for the mind. We don't just need to understand concepts. We need to be engaged through our emotions. Psychologists have lately been calling, I think, the fastest way into someone's inner mind is through their emotions, not through their reason.
Yes.
It's the low road of emotion, not the high road of reason. And that's been, we don't want to be led by our emotions, but in some ways, what I tell my students is your emotions aren't always right about reality, but they are always right about what you think. They are telling you what, you may be wrong about your girlfriend, but they are telling you what you really feel about your girlfriend.
Very good.
They may be wrong about the news, but they're telling you what you feel about the news. They're accurate about that.
And we're going to go through some of the tools, if you will, Professor, in your toolbox to evaluate various kinds of stories. I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap from what we sometimes teach in Bible interpretation. Whether it's theme or context, characterization, or voice or plot is very important. So let's, if we can, talk about theme. And you've got a great quote from Leland Ryken, who's been on the program with us before. And sometimes you'll have somebody ask, well, what was the movie about? What was the book about? And most of the time, people will give you kind of a synopsis. Or if you go to Wikipedia, sometimes you can find out what the synopsis is. But you say that a story's plot isn't necessarily what the story is about. Can you explain?
Yeah, well, it's what happens, but it's not what the story is saying, right? So the theme is actually what the story is about is its theme, and it's the kind of technical definition of it. But it's also it's something that is harder to point to often because it's something that you extract from the events and the characters more than something that is just directly stated. Most of the time, sometimes storytellers will just come out and say the thing. But usually they're making a point, and that point is the thing that you're led up to, but that isn't stated directly. And so it's easier just to say, well, it's a movie about a organized crime family, and the youngest son doesn't want to be involved, and then he gets roped into it, and now we have The Godfather, right? That's easy to say. But what's The Godfather really about? It's been a while since I've seen the film, but probably something more like the corruption of crime and how it destroys your soul. Something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
My conviction is that the basic things that you just listed, the theme, context, characterization, voice, plot, they're taught in middle school and high school language arts classes, and pretty much everybody who's been has a high school education, has been exposed to these ideas. We just don't feel invited to try to, apply them to something like the Bible, which is why I structured the book the way I did. I wanted to give people tools they already had, really, in their own garage. Like, you don't have to bring, an English degree to this process. You can read the Bible for yourself, and you can start to analyze its theme, with some prayer and thoughtfulness and all of that. But this isn't just something reserved for theologians.
Sure. Well, and again, if you talk about the plot of the Bible, I think most people have got that in their head. It's creation, fall, and then salvation, redemption. If something along those lines, people use different words, but that is certainly the case. Or I got to love an English professor that actually talks about Jurassic Park because, if you will, one of the questions is, would dinosaurs eat people? Never even crossed my mind, but of course, Jurassic Park is not as intense if dinosaurs don't eat people. So obviously, you can sometimes look at the broad issues, or you can look at the narrow issues. You can also see the comparison between, for example, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then eventually see a tree show up again in the book of Revelation. So what we've been teaching individuals to know how to interpret a story in terms of theme is something that applies even more significantly to the Bible, doesn't it?
I think it does, and I think one of the things it's missed indirectly, because though we do invite people through altar calls and through the simple proclamation of John 3:16 or whatever, we tell them there's this mechanism for being right with God, that can get turned into a kind of equation that if I just believe this thing, if I just tick a box, that's what God is looking for in order for me to make it to heaven after I die. And the reality of the story is we're being invited into a life that begins at salvation that extends into eternity. It's something that was meant to make your life here and now meaningful, not just an insurance policy, which I'm sure your listeners already agree with that to some, to a lesser or greater extent. But it's in the Scripture that He wants to walk with us, and that's essentially, I would say, one of the major themes of the Bible is that God is relational, and because He's relational, He wants to relate to each of us as a father relates to his children, and He wants us to be able to relate to Him as children can relate to a good and perfect Father. And that unfolds. It's stated in a few places, but it's generally implied. There's a I don't know if we have time for a little bunny trail, but theme is so important, and it's often overlooked because people are afraid, I think, to draw out what isn't there explicitly. Because we're as Christians, we don't want to make a mistake with the Scripture, but that fear can keep us from seeing or contemplating possibilities and recognizing the depth of the Scripture. So here's an example that's not in my book. There are two occasions when Nathan the prophet comes to David. The first one almost everybody knows. It's when he's rebuking him over David's sin with Bathsheba and murdering Uriah the Hittite.
Yes.
And he tells that wonderful story, which convicts David's heart. There's another time, though, afterwards, where he comes back and he gives a message to David, and David completely ignores it. And the message that he gives to David, we ignore because people don't seem to know what to do with it. But to me, it's a theme marker. What Nathan says to David is, name the boy who's born, Solomon, name the boy Jedediah. And he does not name the boy Jedediah, he names him Solomon. So you can say, well, this was a mistake, or this was, who knows why it's in there. You can view it as an aberration. I don't think those things are in there accidentally. I think that statement is in there because it's a story marker for theme. If you look at the meaning of the two names, Solomon is basically peace, and Jedediah is loved by God. And what you see in the life of Solomon is that he went off the rail trying to find a way to get peace through human terms with the surrounding nations. But in doing it, he forsook the love of God. And his name if he'd been, who knows, if he'd been named Jedediah, if he'd been called Jedediah, I was like, this is your identity. Your identity is you're loved by God. If that would have made a difference to him making better choices later on and not sacrificing the love of God in order to have peace with his neighbors.
Very good.
But the end result was not good, right? And just that one little detail, to me, unlocks that what is at least a potential theme for the whole story of Solomon and what happened to Israel under his leadership.
So good. Let me just mention another one before we take a break, and that is context. First of all, you talk about as a lifelong student of the English language, I'm afflicted with an incurable admiration for Shakespeare. And though you say, although it isn't maybe the best play in technical terms, Macbeth is my favorite, perhaps because back in the 8th grade, that was the play that convinced me that literature could be cool. Of course, you've already met my producer who just was in Hamlet recently, so he can certainly relate to that as well. But this idea of context, first of all, there's the biblical context. We had somebody on recently, and the title of his book is I Can Do All Things Through a Verse Taken Out of Context. So obviously, sometimes we have context problems, but you're talking about it in another way. You have a narrative context of the story, and then you have the audience context as well. And when that overlaps, that's where it's relevant. And so context is really important, isn't it?
It is extremely important. And actually, one of the points I try to make in the book is that I think our contexts are being manipulated through storytelling that is trying to divorce us from the real world, which I think is incredibly dangerous. But yes, I think understanding the context of a story, whether it's the context in which it was written, the audience it was directed towards, but also the factors that were shaping people's perception of the world around them when that story was performed. A story like Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand has continued to be relevant in part because he's using universal themes.
Yes.
And going after what it means to be human, what is the nature of love, what is the nature of self-sacrifice. He was actually interviewed in the late 19th century. Edmond Rostand was interviewed, and they said, how come you don't write about current events? And he said, because current event stories will only last as long as the current event. And that's because the context changes. So some contexts change rapidly and others don't seem to change at all. But I think the biblical context, the story of the meta-narrative of Scripture, depends on understanding the shifting context, the background of the spiritual realm from the creation to the cross and from the cross to today.
Daniel Schwabauer with us, and I thought we'd focus on one more, and that's characterization. Obviously, a central character is a protagonist or a hero. And in some cases, as you point out, it could be George Bailey, who doesn't start out as a bad person and It's a Wonderful Life, but eventually comes to a point where maybe it'd be better, he thinks, if he'd never been born. Or you can think of, as you give some other examples, Michael Corleone in the Godfather movies, or Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, because in some respects you're seeing the world through that character, and thus that conditions the way in which you perceive that particular story.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the simplest ways of recognizing story patterns in any kind of story is to ask yourself, how is the character changing? What is the story doing to the character to force them to change? And we call that a character arc. The Bible is full of character arcs. And those arcs can be, as you said, a character might go from good to bad, or from good to great, or from great to bad. You can go either direction with it, but the reason it's important is because that, perhaps more than anything else, will show you what the storyteller intends from the story. It's the forces in the story that are driving the character to this transformation. And sometimes the forces are external, sometimes they're internal, sometimes it's a combination of both. Often it's a combination of both. In It's a Wonderful Life, as you said, George Bailey doesn't go from good to bad. He goes from good to great. And what we understand thematically from the movie, though it never says this, is that his transformation comes because he stops believing a lie.
Yes.
And he believes the truth. And it's a really small lie, seemingly, the lie he believes is that big people do, as they'd say in VeggieTales, big people do big things and little people do little things. And it's powerful, and I use it as an example because it's one of those lies that I think most of us unconsciously accept at some point in life, that if I were really an important person, I would be doing something big with a big name on it. Lots of people would recognize me, that sort of thing. Now, we don't say it out loud because it sounds kind of ugly, and it is kind of ugly. But George Bailey embodies that as a good person who starts to go off the rails thinking that his life was really just inconsequential. And it's because he doesn't recognize that all of the small things he's done have made a very big difference to a lot of people.
The other part of that is the obstacles, because you also talk about Frodo's journey wouldn't be very interesting, certainly not very enlightening, if he caught a ride to Mordor on the back of a giant eagle, or Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz really had to go through that particular journey to even appreciate the words of the wizard at the end. So in some respects, the journey is important. And again, in this high time preference world that we live in this microwave world we live in, where we want everything done, we don't see the value of the obstacles. We don't see the value of the journey. And that's all part of the character arc as well, isn't it?
It sure is. And it's a part of the character arc of being human. And whether we become sons and daughters of God, or whether we push him away at last, is part of every person's arc. I mean, one illustration of the point that you just made, I think is a great illustration, is the parable Jesus tells of the prodigal son. Because if you told the story of the prodigal son, that the son gets his inheritance, tells his father, he doesn't care if he dies or whatever, and he rides off, and then about a half a mile away, he has a change of heart and he comes home. It's not really an interesting story. It's an anecdote, right? The story requires that he gets what he thought he wanted. And he also gets what he didn't know he was asking for, which is all of the baggage that comes with living, wild and being a prodigal. And where that takes him is the place where we often as humans have to end up before we're willing to say, what am I doing?
Sure.
And that's so relatable to me. It's one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite parable that Jesus tells. It's one of my favorite stories in all of literature because it's relatable. We've all, in a sense, been the prodigal. Maybe we've never been at that extreme, but if you could look into every human heart, you would see probably a pigsty, and on some level a kind of reveling in the filth. And if we don't get to that point and recognize, this is not who I want to be. I would rather be a servant in my Father's house than master of the pigs. If we don't get to that place, then we're not understanding the story of humanity correctly. So yeah, the character arcs are essential to understanding any story, and they're really important in the Bible, but we don't give ourselves permission to recognize that they're there, even though they are indeed there.
And of course, even in true stories, you can think of that. Jacob has a first wife, Leah, because he was tricked by his father, her father, Laban, and then has to go and work another 7 years to get Rachel. And so you see the same kind of, and that is not a story, that actually happened, but it illustrates, again, persistence. And in some respects, that is a lesson that is being vicariously, I think, taught to individuals as well. So first of all, let me just mention that we want people to be able to get a copy of your book. We also have a link to, I think we have what we have right now, a link to your Instagram account, and you can find that. Of course, anybody that would want to contact you, you're an English professor at Mid-America Nazarene University. But let me just mention that this book's about 260 pages, published by Baker. It's been out for a couple of months. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get it in paperback, hardback. I think it would be very helpful, Daniel, for people that wanted to understand story and maybe even begin to understand the Bible. So in some respects, you've written it for not just those of us that love the various literature of the world, I think for any Christian, this would be a helpful book to begin to understand the Bible in a fresh and new way.
Well, that is why I wrote it. I wanted the church to feel invited into the story of Jesus in a kind of a fresh way, and I think that's his invitation to all of us, is to take up our cross, to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. But follow him where you can follow him wherever you are. But it does require joining his story and saying, you know what, I'm not qualified to be the storyteller of my own life. I need a better storyteller than myself.
Very good. Well, I just appreciate you writing the book. Appreciate you giving us an hour today. And again, the book is entitled The God of Story, Discovering the Narrative of Scripture Through the Language of Storytelling. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Let me just say that, again, many of us read Scripture as a collection of information and theological truth, and it is that. And certainly we can categorize it and systematize it and analyze it verse by verse, concept by concept, but we miss some of the very important principles of the Bible if we don't also see the broader story, because it is God's story woven together. And so we just thought this would be a very helpful book for you to understand a little bit more about Scripture. It is important for us to understand context and plot and theme, characterization, and these are some very important principles that you will get by reading this book. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.
Megan here, creator of the Point of View Highlights podcast. Thank you so much for listening. It means so much to me that you're here. Your support in this endeavor is huge, and you know what would make it even better? Your feedback. I'd love to hear how you're enjoying these episodes and what you'd like to see in the future. Comment below this episode or message us on social media at POV_highlights on Instagram or Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Don't forget to drop this podcast a follow, and I look forward to seeing you for the next episode. Thanks again for listening to the Point of View Highlights podcast. Bye!